Hello and welcome. My name is Sheldon Richards, and today's assignment is to paint a realistic cartoon character. So I'll be showing you how to do this so you can make your own. And now, if you're not one of my students and you're not doing this as an assignment, feel free to work along with me. It can be a paint-along video. I've got no problem with that. And you can paint your own realistic cartoon character. Yes, that's absolutely fine. So the main concepts we're covering today are using light and shadow to create form, applying color using glazing technique, and adding texture. Okay, so our first step is to gather references and do our drawing. Today I'm going to be painting a platypus. I'm sorry, not a platypus, Puny the Platypus, my own original creation that I came up with myself. So the first thing we want to do is gather our references. So to do this, I Googled, under common usage rights, famous cartoon platypus. I didn't specify any specific platypus because as far as I know, there are none of them that are already extant that I would have to worry about violating the copyright of. So I Googled that and downloaded an image. I lost it, so I'm not going to show it here. Then I also Googled platypus under the same restrictions to make sure everything was copacetic. And I also Googled fedora because I thought, wouldn't it be delightful if my platypus was wearing a little fedora? Yes, that's a wonderful idea. So anyway, I gathered those references up and I'm going to be combining them to make my famous cartoon platypus realistic cartoon character. Sure, the finished product is up on the screen right now, but I haven't done it yet because I haven't started yet. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is make my drawing and my canvas panel the same size. So I'm going to take my canvas panel and I'm going to lay it on top of my drawing paper. And I'm going to mark off the area that sticks out. So I've got a 12-inch by 18-inch sheet of drawing paper and a 12-inch by 16-inch canvas panel. Your paper just needs to be bigger than your panel. Just draw around the edges of the panel and then you'll draw in that area and not draw in the other area. So yeah, now we're ready to roll. You don't need to write draw here and not here on your paper. I'm just showing you what to do. Okay, so now we want to prep our canvas panel. Now our canvas panel already has gesso on it. So we're just going to do a light acrylic wash in an earth tone. Now you can really use any color for this wash. It doesn't matter what color you use. It's traditional to use kind of an earth tone, anywhere from a brown to an orange, maybe more of a yellow or ochre. But you can use whatever you want to be like the primary color of your background. Would be a great choice. The keys here are that it's thin enough that you can draw on it and still see everything. So don't go too dark with it. Otherwise, you're fine. We use acrylic here because it dries quickly. We're going to be using water mixable oil for the painting. You can use that if you want. It just takes a little longer to dry, but if it's thinned out, that shouldn't be an issue. But you can do acrylic under oil, just not the opposite order. So we can do an acrylic coat as our base. That's totally fine. All right. So now I'm going to kind of break down my reference image into basic shapes. So I've got my picture of the famous platypus, famous cartoon platypus. Yes, completely non-copyrighted. Definitely found through completely legal channels. Here he is. Yes, I've never seen this guy before, but I'm going to make him into a realistic platypus. So I'm breaking down his shapes. So basically his torso and head are kind of one curved cylinder. There's no real like neck or anything. So he's like basically like a big piece of macaroni. So the arms are also going to be cylinders, like a set of 2 cylinders with a joint in the middle. And then the beak is a little bit more of a complex shape. So we're going to break that down as well. And then the fedora is basically like a cylinder with a curved plane going around the outside. Okay, so let's sketch this out on our paper. So we're just starting this with the largest shape, which is that curved macaroni cylinder, that big, beautiful slice of tubular pasta. Oh, delicious. Let's just think about a big macaroni. Like it's so big, that you're cutting off slices for your family, like in the old cartoons where the mice are eating a bean. Yeah, that kind of macaroni. So anyway, that's the foundation of our famous cartoon platypus here. All right, I'm sketching it out. I'm deciding it maybe needs to be a little wider at the top just to get everything else proportional. And then we have to work out how to get the rest of the things in here. I'm going to speed it up a little. All right, there we go. Now I'm drawing very fast. Yes, wonderful. Okay, so I want to go in now and add some cross contours. We really want to be thinking about the form as we're drawing it, really like using those cross contours to get a good feel for it. And that should hopefully help us out with the shading later. This is kind of a practice step. You can skip it once you get more accomplished doing this, but I think it's a really good exercise kind of doing this the first time. All right, we've got kind of a curved plane for the brim of the hat, and these are kind of ovoid shapes for the eyes. You can think about like eggs. They're like tall eggs going sideways, something like that. Let's get some cross contours across them. Okay, that's great. Now let's look at the beak here. This complex. We've got kind of a pyramid shape up in the bridge, and then there's almost like a cylinder that wraps around. That's kind of the lip, and then kind of a flat plane going backwards. It's a little bit weird. So let's kind of sketch that in. We want to think about the forms that are making this up. That's really what this is all about, is like coming up with a 2D cartoon character and using your mind to visualize them in a 3D form. All right, so now we want to kind of draw in our firm contour lines. So we're going a little darker for this. And we're sketching this in down below, adding some of those cross contours, defining that form, just keeping in mind how everything curves. Yes, I think that looks pretty good. Got kind of a brow, kind of furrowed here. So I'm adding like a little long cylinder kind of across the top of the eyes. And then I'm darkening in some of my contours here, kind of finalizing those. So we kind of sketch in the basic form and then make the more interesting contours with a darker pencil. So arms are basically going to be cylinders, broken at the elbow. We usually do like a ball for the joint there, a sphere. Then the hands are going to be like little cylinders made out of other little cylinders. So you can think of the whole fist as like a little cylinder with a kind of pyramid shape coming off to the wrist. But the fingers are also little cylinders that wrap around. So we're going to shade them like little horizontal cylinders. Same idea with this arm. All right. And then the hat is basically just a cylinder up on the top with some little dents in it. You got a dent on each side and a long dent through the middle. We don't really see that, so we don't worry about it. And then got just kind of a curved plane going around for the brim. So yeah, we lay that in just like this, and then add those cross contours. All right, so once we've kind of sketched everything in with a light pencil, and then drawn in our contours a little darker with a darker pencil, or a little more pressure. You can just use one pencil for the whole thing, really. You just vary your pressure. If you want to be fancy about it, you can buy nice pencils, softer and harder pencils, sketch with the hard ones, and then draw in with the soft ones. That's fine. But you could also just do all this with a number 2 pencil, just varying your pressure. No problem, especially just for a prep sketch, If you're doing a fine work in graphite, that's a little different, but yeah, for planning sketch, you could just use one pencil. So yeah, I'm darkening in my important contours, and I've got a pretty well-established drawing. Okay, so now we're ready to shade our drawing. So we're going to have the light coming from up and to the left. And so we have a terminator line that runs along this edge here. Going to just kind of smooth that and blend it in. And then shade the rest of it. This is going to be underside, so it's all in shadow. Underside of the lip will be in shadow as well. And then anything that's down low or on the right side, I'm going to shade. And We want to use those cross contours to think about the surface of each form and where the light will fall off and the shadow will start. Now, when we're shading curved surfaces like this, we want to shade with a gradient. We don't need to worry about that too much right now. We just want to find the terminator line. But when we have flat surfaces, they're all going to be even tone. So you'll shade it all to the same degree. Think about what angle it faces away from the light at and shade it. So if a flat surface faces away from the light at all, it's going to be in shadow. If it's facing towards the light as an angle, it's going to be at a varying degree of lightness. If it's facing the light directly, it'll be full light. Any turn away is going to decrease the light value. But most of the fall off happens once the light gets to 90 degrees and is missing the surface. And if it continues to rotate away, it's not going to get any darker. It's just going to be in the even amount of shadow. So yeah, I'm shading in the cast shadow under the brim and just kind of the figure shadows for the rest of it. And here's our finished drawing. I think Puny the Platypus is looking absolutely fantastic. All right, for our second session here, we're going to do a transfer, and then we're going to shade. It's all going to be done in charcoal. You could also do it in graphite. That would be fine. So you could either take a clean sheet of paper, or you can do this on the back of your drawing. You're just going to rub charcoal or graphite all over the whole thing. You can use a chalk pastel as well. Sometimes if you're wanting to get some contrast, a chalk pastel works really nicely, especially if you're doing it onto a dark surface. The charcoal can be hard to see. So if you use like a neon pink pastel, sometimes that enables you to see the transfer better. But you can also use graphite for this. The graphite's just a little lighter, so the charcoal works pretty well generally. All right. So after that's all smudged on and smeared, you want to shake it off to get rid of excess charcoal. And you're just going to put it down on top of your panel. And if you're doing the drawing on a separate sheet, you'll put that on top of this. And then it wouldn't be a bad idea to tape the whole thing down. Now we'll go ahead and trace over the whole thing using a colored pencil. You could use anything. You could use a stick for this. It doesn't even need to draw. I like using a colored pencil because I could see where I've already traced and where I haven't yet. So I'm going to trace in all the contour lines, not the cross contours, just the regular contours, and then the terminator lines that show where the shadows end. And from that, I will have a pretty good map of where I need to shade with my charcoal on my panel. All right, I think that's all coming along nicely. We're tracing over everything, getting it done, going at 4 times speed. Oh yes, I speed it up, then I don't have to talk as long. Because what am I talking about now? Absolutely nothing. I'm not talking about anything, nothing at all. All right, but here comes a magic trick. Ready? Look at it. Shazam! It's transferred. Beautiful. Now this can save you a lot of extra work. And I like being lazy. It's wonderful. There's more time to play video games and watch TV. So anyway, I like to use this transfer technique to free up some time. You can see it kind of transfers pretty light, so you kind of have to go over it again. And we also want to shade in all of our shadow areas. And we're going to be painting that right into our painting, so it's going to be useful later on. We're not doing extra work, God forbid. Now, just finished tracing and shading in everything, and then we'll be ready to move on. So there we go. We're just about done. Doesn't look like much. I'm going to be the first to admit it. In this case, though, it's a good idea to keep it simple, whether you're smart or stupid. You just need flat shadow map, basically, and a map of all the contours. We don't need to get fancy with it. We'll do that when we start painting. All right, so here we go. Here's our guy, our completely original, famous cartoon platypus. Isn't he wonderful? I'm so excited to get some paint on this. That's the fun part. All right, so let's talk about what I'm doing. Taking a little black paint here, and I'm going to thin it out. I'm using water because I'm using water mixable oils. You could use turpentine if you're using oil paint, or water if you're using acrylic. You just want to make kind of a thin wash. You can add a little bit of medium to it if the consistency is not what you want, but a thin wash will do just fine. We're just kind of underpainting right now, so it's not super important. But I do want it to dry fairly quickly. So if I'm using oil paint, I want to keep it thin and lean. I do some water, turpentine, maybe a little quick drying medium if you want to thicken it up, but make sure you add a drying agent if you're not working super thin. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and just paint in all of the shadows. I'm just going right over the charcoal, letting the charcoal blend in with the paint, and it should get enough of it stuck to the canvas that we're good. But the black paint in there helps make sure we get nice even coverage all throughout. All I'm trying to do here is block in the map of the shadow where everything's going to be falling, and I'm going to do most of the rest of the contouring with the gray layers. So you want to keep this nice and flat. You don't need a lot of variation in your shadow value. You want to keep it at about like a medium dark. We want to be able to go darker still for adding details to the shadow, or like adding super dark areas. But we want it to be clearly in the shadow family. So yeah, we just kind of got to go over all the charcoal, lock that down in place, just make it a little more firm and affix it to the surface. And then we are good to proceed to our highlights and halftones. All right, so now our guy looks like this. Again, not very impressive yet, but as long as we've mapped in those shadows accurately, we should be in a good spot right here and ready to continue on the next session. So you can let that dry, or you can continue if you have extra time. Let's move on to the highlights and halftones. All right, now we're moving on to highlights and halftones. This is where the fun really starts. Let's go on to a little palette setup. So I'm going to want to mix a little bit of white, a little bit of black, and a little bit of fast-drying medium. If you're using acrylics, you might want to use a little retarder to actually slow your drying time. But if you're using oils, something to speed the drying time up would be great, especially if you're planning on your next session being anytime soon, because if you just use the regular oils, it's going to take a while. All right, so I've got a little fast-drying medium in my little cup here. Imagine I squeezed a little black out on the palette, and now I'm squeezing out a little white. And I'm taking my sweet time, aren't I? Hurry it up. We're ready to go. Come on. I'm going to cut some of the... All right. A little splice. Cut and splice. A little speed up. All right. We're mixing in some fast-drying medium with the white here. It's still very slow. Painfully boring. We're going to mix a little bit of black with some fast-drying medium. And then we're going to pull a little string. So with the string, what we're trying to do is mix some of one color into the other color gradually. So we've got nice transitions, and we've got a range of values or tints or shades or whatever to pick from as we paint in. So we kind of pull a little bit over from one side, a little bit over from the other side, and mix them together. So we want to get gradual transition like that. The other thing we want to do here is mix a little pool of kind of a medium gray. It's maybe the mid-level gray, right in the middle of the value scale. I'm going to add some medium to that, a little bit of water. You could add turpentine if you're doing regular oils, water for acrylics, acrylic medium. So you want it to be like not super washy. You want it to have a little body still, but you want it to be thin enough that you can still see the drawing through. All right. So what I want to do is lay in my gray glaze here, and then I want to add highlights to that. So I'm going to think about where the light's hitting most directly, add a little bit of white, and then pull that away. I can use the same brush, or I can use a clean brush. Now, if the paint feels a little stiff, I can add some water or turpentine to the brush thin it out a little bit and get a little more mobile. We want to be careful with that, though, because we want to maintain our contrast. We want to have nice, strong white on the highlights and a nice gradation into the grays. That being said, since we're glazing over this, we want to push the contrast and have high contrast between our lights and our darks, because that's going to be reduced a little bit once we get into the glazing phase. So I'm going to work through the whole painting in that fashion, laying down a coat of gray, and then on top of that, adding in my white, and then pulling that highlight away. So if you have kind of a less intense highlight, you can use kind of a medium light and do the same sort of thing with it. You don't always need to hit the intense white highlight, but just kind of go through the whole thing and just render all the forms there. So remember, for this, curved surfaces are going to have a gradient, which is a gradual transition from light to dark, whereas flat surfaces are going to have one unified value. Okay, so here I'm finishing my first pass. The contrast is still a little bit low, so I'm going to make another pass, add some more white, pull it out, try to push that contrast a little more. Second pass looks something like this. I'm actually going back in and darkening my shadows as well, pushing that contrast again. Remember, we can push both directions. We can make it darker and lighter. At the end of this, I want to have nice contrast between light and dark. I want to have white areas and black areas and good transitions between them, a nice range of values. And that will be reduced a little as I do my glazing step. So I really want to try to push it in this step here and have really dramatic contrast. All right, so this would be a great place to end session 3. We have to let things dry before we glaze. So while we're waiting, this would be a great time to like this video, if you feel so inclined, and also subscribe. If you've already liked it, maybe you could share it with a friend. It's actually perfect. Just keep sharing it until the painting is dry, and then we can continue. Another thing you could do while you're waiting is paint in the background. Yeah, so this definitely needs a better background. We don't want to leave just the washy background. So I've painted in kind of just a layer of orange. I just mixed an orange and painted it. I mixed a couple analogous colors, like some lighter oranges, some yellows, reds, some browns, and kind of modeled those in throughout. But I'm just kind of making a generic sort of portrait background, like if you went to a photo studio and got some portraits taken, just kind of the painted background they might put behind you. Real simple, nothing complex about it. All right, so now we're going to go on to the glazing portion of our painting here. So glazing is all about adding color. So we're going to add a little quick dry medium, as well as some color. So we're going to start with the body of our platypus. And I thought, wouldn't it be whimsical to make him green? Yes, that's obviously, definitely, certainly an idea nobody's thought of. That, with the combination of the fedora, are going to make this a completely original character. So mixing some fast-drying medium with some phthalo green, along with some alizarin crimson and other colors to make it a little more complex. I don't want to use it right out of the tube there. Make it a little more complex. Okay, so we want our glaze to be thick enough that it has a little body to it, but also thin enough that we can still see the underpainting through. We don't want to cover up everything. We want to be able to see through, but we also want to still be able to get a decent amount of color onto it. So work with the consistency. You might want to test it out on a scrap paper or in your sketchbook or something before you get it onto your painting. But it should be like this, where we can coat it and still see the underpainting through. So the idea is the same as with our highlights and halftones. We want to apply a glaze first, just kind of the color we're trying to apply. And then we want to add some highlights and halftones to it. So we're going to mix a little string after this of green, and we're going to add highlights in the lighter areas and midtones in the lower areas. So we're scraping all our paint together here and mixing a shadow tone. So we're also mixing a string by adding a little bit of white on this end of the green and blending them together. I made the shadow tone by adding a little red because that's the complementary color of the green. It'll mix a nice shadow tone. I generally want to stay away from using black for that. It's usually a bad idea. Usually the complementary color will give you a nice shadow tone. You can also just go with a blue or a purplish tone, kind of a desaturated gray or brown, kind of tinting towards cool. Something like that is fine. But generally speaking, if you don't know what to do, just use the complementary color. So you can see I'm adding a lighter tint of the green to the areas where the light's hitting, and then pulling it into the mid-value areas. I'll just kind of work through in that way with the entirety of the body. And then when I go on to the hat and the bill or beak, whatever it is, I will use those respective colors as well. So that's pretty much the idea. Again, I might want to make more than one pass if my contrast is not enough, if it's getting a little too muddy. I'm also going to go back in and go over my shadow tones again. If I need to work the gradients along the terminator lines there, I can do a little blending there with a clean brush. So depending on where your gradients are at, you may want to focus on that or not. Okay, same idea with the hat and the beak here. We want to mix a local color, kind of a glaze of that. Lay that in. We also want to mix a shadow tone and a string of lighter values. And then we'll paint in the shadow tone for the shadow. You can feather that in along any gradient transitions and then add the lighter values to the highlights as well. So pretty much the same thing, just different colors for whatever other objects you have. So at this point, we can see everything's really starting to come together. We're starting to get an idea of what the final painting is going to look like. You can make another pass if you need to pull that contrast a little further, or if you want to add any color. But we're pretty much ready to move on to our texture. All right, it's looking pretty decent so far. This is going to end our session. If you have extra time and you haven't done your background yet, that'd be a great thing to work on right now. So I think this is starting to look pretty good. It's all starting to get tied together. It just goes to show that paintings are a lot like children. They go through awkward phases and they shouldn't be abandoned, because more often than not, or sometimes at least, they come together at the end and it's all worthwhile. And we might as well see before we decide whether we're going to abandon paintings and or family members. All right, so now we're going to be adding some texture. So for this, we want to start mixing a range of green values in the lighter side of the family. We don't really need to worry about applying texture to the shadow spots. We just want to get the light areas. So we want to think about which areas in our painting require texture. Not all of them necessarily will, but the fur here definitely does. So the key is that I'm laying in lighter values on top of darker values to make that texture happen. But there needs to be a contrast of some sort, either in color or value or saturation, whatever, to make that texture happen. So usually we want to apply a lighter tone on top of a darker tone. So what I've done here is I've mixed a nice green match to the color I had down, and then I pulled a string using some white, so I've got a nice range of values. And I can add white as necessary, but I just want this value to be a little bit lighter. I'm going to work my way over the entirety of the surface here, just kind of working from dark to light. You could certainly also go the other direction. That might even be better now that I'm thinking about it. I don't know. This seems like it worked out all right. But either direction seems like it should be fine. I kind of like working from dark to light because you can kind of build up the lighter layers overlapping the dark. And I think generally that makes a better texture. But I don't know. You could try it either way. Applying the lightest touches. One of the things you might think about is how shiny each surface is. If you've got a very shiny surface, you probably want your highlights to be lighter, maybe a pure white even. If you've got a more matte surface, it's going to be more of a mixture of the white and the local color. So it'd be like a light green in this situation. Anything that's shiny and actually reflecting light strongly is going to have intense white highlights generally. But if something's a little more matte, you're just going to go with a tint version of whatever hue you're using for the local color. I don't have any texture to add to the hat really, but I'm not super happy with the color. I don't feel like it's fully developed, so I'm making another pass on that. Same idea as before. I'm just glazing it with the local color and then adding various tints made from that color to the highlight areas. And I can also build up the shadow tones as necessary as well. And then just kind of rendering them into each other along the contours of the hat form up there. I'm also going to add a little more color to the bill, get a little color variation in there. So I'm doing a little more yellow. I'm kind of adding yellow to the areas that might be a little more worn. In the same way that skin has variation in the color, I think it's visually more interesting if the bill has some of that going on as well. So in the kind of more worn out exposed areas, I'm doing a little more yellow toned. I'm also adding in some white to kind of bring out highlights there. And then I'm going to keep the deeper oranges in like the more recessed areas. I think it makes it a little more complex and interesting. Okay, so here he is, Papa the Platypus, our completely original IP that we've created today. He's looking wonderful, but he's not quite where I want him to be. He's not quite that weird, uncanny combination of realism and cartoonity. So we're going to have to do finishing up session. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how do I get this into that real sweet spot that you see with the realistic cartoons. And I'm thinking what it lacks is realistic features, namely these weird nostrils and this weird beady eye. So I'm going to add those. So I'm going in with a white colored pencil to do a little sketching. This isn't really like going to be a permanent part of the painting, so it just needs to be where I can see it. So I'm just kind of going in and drawing here, making a little round beady eye, and I'm going to try to figure out and position the other one. I want to make them kind of spread out, maybe a little wall-eyed, so I'm going to kind of move it over a little bit to the right. I think this is just for positioning, but I think this looks about right. All right, so I'm mixing up a shadow green tone, and I need that to kind of paint over the eyes that I have in place. And then I'm going to paint in the round beady eyes. I'm going to use kind of an ochre color for the iris as well as an alizarin crimson. So yeah, I'm just kind of painting over in that shadow tone. We generally want to keep the shadows nice and flat. So I'm going to go over the whole shadow as necessary with the same tone. Just kind of unify all the shadow under the brim of that hat. Make it nice and flat. So I'm also adjusting the shape of the shadow there. I feel like the curve was a little bit off before, so I've kind of readjusted that. And we've got everything pretty much covered. Our sins are mostly hidden, not absolved, maybe, but hidden. Wonderful. Okay, so now I've got my red and my ochre. I'm going to do my ochre for the bulk of the iris there, and then just a little red around the outside. I'm also going to go over the pupils with some black, get them nice and dark, and hit the highlights again. Now, with the highlights under the brim of the hat like they are, I don't know that you'd be catching that highlight, but I feel like it's good for making the eyeballs look nice and wet, the way we all like our eyes to be. You know, we don't want to be thinking about how uncomfortable this platypus man is that we've created completely originally from thin air. We don't want him to be uncomfortable with dried out eyes, all itchy and painful, terrible. All right, so I'm darkening in with the black, making the pupils nice and dark, and popping in some highlights. Now, I think we need a little definition on that right socket. So I'm going to mix a little bit of a green to catch some reflected light maybe. But this area should be darker than anything that's in the light area. So I only want a little bit of a value variance between the rest of the shadow and this reflected light here. All right, that all looks pretty good. So now it's just a matter of adding the weird little nostrils. So for that, I'm going to be mixing a light yellow, like a string of yellow tones, and a shadow yellow by mixing in a little purple with it, darkening it. So I'm going to use a shadow tone here and paint in the two nostrils. I'm going to go around those with the light yellow tint and a little bit of shadow on the back edge right there. Then just kind of feather that together with a clean brush to soften it as much as I want. And then I'm pretty much done. So that was my finishing session. Your finishing session might be different. I think it's really important that you do a finishing session, that you have some time with your art where you don't have any specific objective except to make it as good as possible. In this session, you should probably spend a lot of time just looking at the work. Boredom is one of the most important foods for creativity. And I think having some time where you're bored, where you don't know what to do next, is one of the most valuable things. Because that's where the weird stuff that makes you who you are is going to pop out. You get weird when you're bored. I think we've all probably had that experience before. And that's an important part of making art. So I would encourage you to try to pace yourself so that you have time at the end, so you're not rushing for deadlines, but you have a little bit of time to just sit with the art and think about how you, as an individual artist, could make this better. And the things that you're going to come up with when you're bored are going to be invaluable, and they're going to be the things that make your work distinctive and unique. All right. So that's how to do it, in my best opinion. I hope that you find success with this and if good results you're happy with. So I hope that this brings you one step closer to making your own creations you want to make. This technique is great for doing complex forms, anything that has complex interactions with light and shadow, because you can separate the values from the color, from the texture, and just take things one step at a time. And I think it really teaches you how to paint. And then later, when you're just kind of going wild, you've got a lot more tools you can use. So that's it for today. I hope this was helpful, and we will see you next time. Thank you.